I'm Matt.
Hey, I'm Steve.
Hey, I'm John.
This is the Sober Friends Podcast. We're here for the sober curious, the new guy, and the old timer. We're here to talk about the stuff anyone looking to live alcohol-free has to face day to day, and how we overcame those struggles. We speak for no 12-step group, but we do try to remain anonymous. You're not alone. This is the Sober Friends Podcast. Today I got a different co-host. Steve is not with us. But man, you are going to love the person on the podcast today. It's Mary Tilson. She's the host of the Sun and Moon Sober Living podcast. I just had a conversation with Mary on her podcast. Now she's coming on this podcast, and I can't wait for you to hear her story and the amazing things that she has done in life and recovery that make me think I'm too sheltered and I put the bar too low for myself. Because I listen to her episodes and I'm like, wow, you've done that? Why am I too afraid to do some of this stuff? Mary, welcome to the Sober Friends Podcast.
Matt, thank you so much for the introduction. And it's so nice to see you again. We were just recording yesterday yeah.
Well, we'll try and make sure that the storms don't come and blow you out. As we're talking, just hear the thunder in the background, and nature's not something we can control. It's another reminder of what we can and what we can't control. That's not one of them.
Absolutely. I've been experiencing that a lot this past week. We've been having uncharacteristically rainy weather here in Colorado. So yeah, you might pick up on some of that.
And at the time we're taping this, this is the time that all the smoke is blowing in from Quebec into the Northeast, and nobody else in the family has been affected except for me. And it just feels like I've got light bronchitis and it stinks. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about you, your recovery. How I look at your story as great because it's a message to somebody thinking, how the heck am I going to put down the bottle and not have this crutch and still live life? And you've done so much in your life by putting down the bottle, more than it's like, wow, that's actually possible. How do you have the guts to do those things? So Mary, you start wherever you want to start. What got you to this place where we're on sober podcasts?
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you say it like that, because that's something that I feel really passionate about for people, is kind of reframing this idea that we need alcohol and all different types of substances to have fun and have an exciting life, because I definitely believed that. I started experimenting with alcohol and marijuana when I was young, 13 years old, just before going into high school. And I leaned into that fully. My whole social life was designed around it. I used to love partying every night that I could all through high school. And I always used to say that I kind of got through that without any major consequences. But looking back, there were some moments where I just escaped, a pretty serious encounter either with the police or getting into trouble myself. But it was when I went away to school at the University of Colorado in Boulder, which I just moved back very close to Boulder. And, it's a beautiful place, and it's also notoriously...
College?
Is it what?
The Mork and Mindy College? Like in the beginning, I might be dating myself here. At the very beginning of Mork and Mindy, like he's standing on the Robin Williams standing on the uprights, and I thought it was Boulder.
I'll have to double check. I'm not totally sure, to be honest.
Here. This is an old show. This might be before your time.
Yeah. Yeah, but I went away to school there, and I remember my parents had some hesitations because it's notoriously a big party school. Yep. But I went in with this agreement. I was going to get good grades. I was going to graduate in 4 years, not the 8 that people do when they go out to snowboard and ski. And I'll keep a long story short, but during that time, it started off a lot of fun. I was partying 7 nights a week, very active in the Greek life. But I also discovered cocaine and Adderall and ecstasy during that time. And I really thought those were the miracle drugs because I could party every night of the week. I could take Adderall to study. Mind you, I was not prescribed. And, the more that I started using those substances, I was able to drink a lot more. And that's when I started blacking out and my behavior started to really shift. And I started to notice that I was acting really out of character. And it started to be brought to my attention, but I was in such denial. And I basically went through a series of events in a short period of time, the second semester of my junior year, where I I would be like blacking out on a family vacation and passing out in lobbies or doing drugs in the bathroom. Or, I was at a party and I accidentally snorted a huge line of ketamine, which was one of the scariest experiences of my life. And, there were these series of bottoms that amounted to one particular night, my junior year, or one morning, I should say, where I woke up and I just could not face the day. I was so consumed, and my behavior up until that point, I would wake up feeling paranoid and anxious if I'd blacked out. I would suggest to my friends we go get Bloody Marys, drink it off, keep going, make a joke out of it. But that day, everything led up to that point. It was all consuming. And I remember I called my mom. I'll never forget the feeling because I couldn't walk out of my bedroom and face my friends. And I was like, please get me out of Boulder, get me out of here. Please fly me back to Chicago. That's where I was from. And she could hear the panic in my voice. And for her, I think it was relief because she had seen this downward spiral and she had expressed concern. And so my thinking was, just get me away from the drama for a little bit. I need to just escape this, get myself sorted. But next thing you know, I'm in outpatient treatment at Hazleton in Chicago. Okay. First time I had gone. Certainly was not ready to call myself an alcoholic or an addict. I had no exposure before that to the 12 steps or recovery, aside from like what you see in the movies.
That's a good aside. We've talked about this on your show, that many people refer to themselves as many different things, which is okay. How would you refer to yourself? How do you identify?
Well, I came to a later point. So I went back to treatment 3 years later, and I completely was fine by that point. I had learned the lessons to identify as an alcoholic and addict. I had to prove that to myself for 3 more years. But at that time, I was in such denial that I was like, no, I'm just I'm a college student. I had all of the justifications. I was othering myself from everybody else in the room, comparing why they're in a different stage of life. They're not 20 years old. Like, always their situation is different. I'm okay. And so at that point, I did not identify as an alcoholic. I just identified as someone who had gotten myself in a little bit of trouble, as college students do in my mind. Oh, yeah. And but later on, I did come to identify as an alcoholic when I went back to treatment.
How does it feel to identify as an alcoholic? I'm thinking of those who are considering this lifestyle of giving up alcohol, and also other people who identify with having alcohol use disorder, however they want to identify. What does it mean to you when you say alcoholic? Because that can be a scary term.
Yeah, so this conversation fascinates me because at the time, so the first time I went to treatment was 13 years ago. The time that I got sober was 10. I didn't know there was any other option. So I just knew, like, that's all I knew. And so at the time that I was ready to call myself that, rather than seeing that as something negative, it was liberating for me. Because when I was ready to admit that I had a problem and I needed to give up alcohol and drugs completely, I listened to what people say about this concept of, like, if you were allergic to a particular food, you would just accept that you had the allergy and you would move on with your life by not consuming it. And I know that there's a lot more complexity when it comes to this conversation. And I completely respect that people choose not to use that term anymore and choose to use alcohol use disorder. Do I think it's a prerequisite to getting sober? Absolutely not. But I do think for me, it was by saying I'm an alcoholic, I'm an addict, it's very clear. It's a clear line. If I remove this thing from my life, these things, then I can go on and be free from them. I do not have to live my life in this constant inner conflict, trying to battle, trying to, wear myself out by trying to figure out, like, should I drink tonight? Am I drinking too much? How fast is the person next to me drinking? Why are they drinking so slow? How can I get cocaine? It's like all this madness. And so by saying that, like, this is who I am, to me, I saw it as like, I accept myself. Like, this is who I am, and I'm willing to accept myself for this. And I'm willing to choose now recovery over continuing to go down this path, which is causing me harm. But it took me a while to get there.
So this is fascinating, because if you go to your podcast and you look at your cover art and you see a picture of you, there's this very nice, sweet girl that is like the girl next door who, not in a million years would you guess, had been snorting ketamine or have been getting Adderall without a prescription. And I think it says something to us that I think the person we are after is our true self. It's just the drugs and alcohol make us into that monster. That's something else. But I'm fascinated by that because I look at you now, I'm like, how is that possible? You don't look anything like somebody who's smoking doobies, doing lines of cocaine, ketamine, crying to mom. It just seems so foreign to who you are. Yet that's the reality of what your life was.
Well, it's so funny that you say that because part of the reason that I decided to start sharing more openly about being sober, which took me years, by the way, was and I'm sure we can talk more about what my recovery has looked like, but I ended up going and moving to Southeast Asia and teaching yoga and retreats. And people would find out that I had this history of, drinking and partying, and they just didn't believe me. They were like, and I started to feel like, am I portraying, I feel like my identity has now split in another direction. I also don't want to give off an impression to people that I'm this wholesome yoga teacher living out in the jungle, because I think that's just the important thing is to by owning this part of myself and being able to be more open with the fact that I do have this history. It's my way of hopefully sharing with people that you do not have to be stuck in this identity of this person who's kind of known for being the one who always is getting too drunk and always is the one trying to encourage other people to take it a little too far by getting drugs or whatever. And I mean, the ketamine thing was a one-off thing, I will say, and it was a mistake. But yeah, I mean, it's funny, I shouldn't even say that because it's sometimes we create this hierarchy around substances when at the end of the day, to me, I look at it, it's why was I doing that in the first place?
I bring it up more than there's more to us and our story than meets the eye. And just because you make a snap judgment looking at somebody, you don't know what their past is. You don't know what's inside of them. And things could be so much more wildly different. And if you were really that wild person at one time, that doesn't have to be who you are, that you could be someone chill, responsible, testing the limits. You're talking about Bali now, and I don't want to get out of order here because that's the part. In talking how did you have the guts to do that type of stuff? That's where I am, where I'm that's what I'm talking about is oh my God, how do you have the guts to do that? How did you find the money? But I kind of want to get to that place of where was the line where you said, this is more painful to continue doing this than if I stop? Yeah,
well, I'm glad you asked about that because I think it's also really important for people to understand, it's not I made this big courageous decision to go travel, and it actually came from a lot of necessity of feeling I needed to change my environment and change a lot about my lifestyle. But basically how I came to that realization, that I needed to change my life, eventually I went back to treatment after I graduated. I was working at a digital media agency in Chicago, and I found myself in an industry where there was a beer cart going around the office at 5 p.m. where I could go out every night. Yeah, which I helped organize, of course. I could go out every night of the week. And, this cocaine habit, unfortunately, I didn't lose the craving, but it was no longer kind of socially acceptable when you're not a college student anymore. But I had a drug dealer in Chicago who I could text message and he would come and meet me. And so what would happen is I would get really drunk, whether I was with my friends or at work functions. But what really started to scare me was when I was at work functions and I would text him and go out and meet him, and I would be buying cocaine and doing it by myself in secrecy. And those were the moments where I was things have really gotten bad here because I could lose my job over this. There was a time when I was at the United Center in Chicago where the Bulls play for a concert, and I had gone somehow from the skybox down out past security, got in his car, came back in with it stuffed in my shirt, just crazy stuff like that. And so the final straw was one night I had done that. I'd gone out and then I was doing coke in my bedroom. And it was 4 a.m. and I kind of came to and was oh my God, I have to go to work tomorrow. What am I going to do? And I had the brilliant idea of I'll just go because I'm so wide awake and I'm, ready to go. And it wasn't the kind of day that I could miss because we were in planning season. Right. And so Thank God. I mean, I went in ridiculously early and I'm sitting there looking at spreadsheets, like going cross-eyed. And I was like, I have to get out of here. Like, what am I doing? I can't believe I thought this was a good idea. And I went home and I called my mom. I didn't want to tell her over the phone, but I was like, hey, will you come downtown? Like, I'm not at work today. Let's get coffee. And my poor mom, so I just sat her down and I was like, and I felt bad because, my parents had helped me go to treatment the first time and I didn't take it seriously. And so I was like, really like, can you help me? I can't get this under control. And there had been a series of events leading up to that where I did help people close to me ask people close to me in my life for help. And so at that time I was fully ready and I already knew the 12 steps. I had developed, a yoga practice at that time. But prior to that, over the few years leading up to that, I was more in tune with myself and I was ready. And so I went back to outpatient treatment. And when I finished that, I was terrified because Chicago is like a drinking city and not so much anymore. But I was like, what is life in Chicago if you don't drink? I certainly didn't know what it looked like. And there's amazing people, friends of mine that I know there now who are doing great things for the Chicago sober community. But I put myself in yoga teacher training because that was how I was going to fill the time. And I loved yoga and I was curious to learn more about it. Never saw myself becoming a teacher. But during that process, I started studying more than just the practice that I had experienced by going to classes. And it's a psychological practice, spiritual, there's a whole philosophy behind it. And the amazing thing about that was as I started to learn about the philosophy of yoga, there are so many common threads with the 12 steps. And so I was just like, I didn't really know why the yoga was so supportive for me, but I was just like so fascinated by these common threads. And that actually led me to finding a lot of the teachers that I studied with who kind of marry those, the somatic tools of yoga with the cognitive and spiritual practices, namely my teacher, Nikki Myers, who founded Y12SR. And so, I did that training and I'm starting to have all of these big questions about my life. Like, do I want to be in this media agency, which, it was an amazing job. I worked with incredible people and I'm very grateful for the accounts that I got to work on. But as somebody who's sober, it was a very different story when all of your networking is happening around drinks and, the beer cart in the office. It was a very tricky environment to navigate in early sobriety. And so shortly after I finished my teacher training, one of my really good friends from college came out to visit me in Chicago. And she told me, I decided I'm going to quit my job and go travel Southeast Asia for 3 months. And then I'm going to figure out what I really want to do because I'm really unhappy and it's having a negative toll on my health. And I was like, something deep inside me was like, I need to go too. And that was not a normal response, but it was more out of I desperately need a change. I need to figure something out and I want to go too. And so because I was no longer drinking and I was no longer buying substances, I started saving up my money. And I think it was 4 or 5 months after that point of saving that I ended up leaving that job and going on a backpacking trip to Southeast Asia. And,
fascinating to me.
Yeah, there was a lot of, this sounds crazy because I couldn't have even pinpointed Thailand on a map. That was the first place we flew to. We had just one destination picked out. We were flying into Bangkok and 2 other friends ended up joining too. So it was 4 of us in total. And I had no idea about that part of the world. Something in me was just telling me to go. And when I got out there, I had an opportunity. I was visiting a yoga retreat center as a guest in Cambodia. It's one of the things that we did on our backpacking trip. Really rustic center. You would stay in these grassy bamboo huts in the jungle and walk barefoot. And it was just this beautiful center. And I had the opportunity to guest teach a class there when I was a guest, which led to a job offer. And, that whole trip went from 3 months to 6 months and we extended and, we were backpacking around and doing some workaways, which are work exchanges. But instead of flying back home, I was given a job opportunity to go and teach yoga at this yoga and meditation retreat center, which, and for me, when I look back on that, I was still very new in my recovery, and I didn't really trust myself. Like, that was part of the reason that I was out there. I wasn't ready to go back to Chicago. That was a very scary thought for me because people weren't really open about being sober or like owning that as something positive, especially like the way I saw it at my age. I was like, what is my life going to look like? And so the opportunity to go and live at this center was such a incredible gift because, for one, we had this disciplined daily schedule, which was really supportive of my recovery. We woke up every morning to the sound of a gong, and we would go into the meditation hall and meditate and chant and do breath work and yoga. And the whole day was very structured. There were philosophy talks. And just, you got the opportunity to connect with people without substances because you're at a yoga and meditation retreat center. There's no substances allowed there. There wasn't even phones or caffeine allowed there. It was like no screens, no Wi-Fi, no caffeine.
I don't know about the caffeine.
That was a struggle.
Breaking deal breaker.
Well, I did have my little coffee shop in the village that like sometimes I'd hop on my bike and cycle over. I felt like I was like really breaking the rules, but yeah.
I'm just like fascinated by the whole, how do you get the money together? How do you get on the plane? How do you get out there? But I can also understand if you're in Cambodia, that's about as far culturally as you can get from Chicago, one of the biggest cities on the planet, to one of the most rural places that has vegetation and culture that's totally non-Western. I mean,
yeah.
How do you deal with the language?
Yeah, well, it's so true. I mean, and the money thing, that was the biggest question that people had was, how are you doing that? And I was not traveling in a luxurious way by any means whatsoever. I mean, we saved money to get out there. And interestingly, the flight ticket was a flight voucher that I had earned when I was on a family vacation where I was so drunk that I could barely get on the plane. And they said, if anyone gets off, we'll give you $1,000 plane voucher. And I was like, me. And so that ended up being how I paid for that voucher ended up being how I paid for my flight over there. But we were staying in accommodations that were like hostels, and we were backpacking around, and we were doing work exchanges. So that part is accessible. And I know for a lot of people that seems like it's a big barrier if you're willing to travel that way. But yeah, I mean, in terms of adjusting culturally, I remember this one time having this realization because we were out in this farming village where cattle-drawn carriages would ride by the center. Like, I kid you not, they were being pulled by cattle. And it was such simple living. And I'd ride my bike into this village, and, like all the local farmers would bring out all the fruits and vegetables. And that was what was being used at the center for all of the meals. And it was just so healing and exactly what I needed. I think that I was in that cycle of just like work hard, play hard, and I was always stimulating myself. It was like all of the substances, it was always like this stimulation from the environment, whereas everything was just so peaceful there. And so on the one hand, you could say, like, how do you go from this city apartment in Chicago to a grass hut where there's like geckos running in? But I always think, and I say to people now, like, nature is the greatest healer.
I agree.
And yeah, so it was like my whole nervous system would just settle. And yeah, there was this cow that was like right outside of my hut that I would always hear letting out like a big moo, and the sounds of roosters, like all the things you associate with these type of places. But yeah.
It feels like in an unorthodox way, you're doing steps 1, 2, and 3 by doing this trip. Clearly, you're connecting with some higher power of some different way there, because that's all I'm hearing from this conversation is this connection to the universe.
Yes, 100%. And it's interesting you say that, because I remember the second time that I went to treatment and I was ready to actually commit myself to recovery, I was like, I just don't know what to do about this God and higher power thing, because it's not that I was resistant, but I was like, I only think about the church. And again, like, it's not like I have a negative association, but it just feels like shaky ground to rest my sobriety on, because I don't have a strong relationship. And fortunately, somebody said, it can be nature. And I kind of grasped onto that, but I was like, okay, like, I don't get it, but I'm just going to go with that. Like, that will be my higher power. And there was times when I was traveling, particularly I did this trek in the Himalayas, and I remember just being overwhelmed with this rush. It was like a high that felt like this realization of like, this is what I was seeking in like cocaine, or I always wanted these like big rush experiences. And I just remember being so taken by like, you know, the high of moving your body, but being surrounded by these mountains. And I got it. Like in that moment, it was like something clicked. And I was like, this is my higher power, you know, being in nature.
You're the first person I've ever met who's been to the Himalayas. And I may not meet another person that I can identify with. When I was in San Francisco and I saw the Pacific Ocean, and I knew in my lifetime I've seen both the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, and know that there's very limited people on the planet who can say that. Like, that's an achievement. And I think I saw on your website a picture of you in the Himalayas. I'm like, wait, what? How? She went to the Himalayas too? Like, how did that happen? How do
what
you
was
just
your
say,
experience?
I'm going to the Himalayas? It's kind of a remote place.
I was traveling again. So we went in with a very loose plan, and it started off as 4 of us, and 2 of the girls ended up sticking with the original 3-month plan. And then me and, you know, my best friend, who was my roommate in Chicago, we were like, let's keep going. I mean, when are we going to be back out here? Funny enough, I ended up staying for quite a while after that. But we were like, let's keep going. And we were meeting people, and people started talking about this trek, the Annapurna Circuit. And she had trained and done like half marathons and was a runner and super physically fit. And I had never done anything like that. Like really like very, very minimal hiking, which is pretty much limited to like the trip that we had been on so far. And so she's like, we've got to do it. And I was like, you're crazy. Like, I cannot do that. I am not in the physical shape to spend 21 days hiking through Nepal. Like, there's just no way. And so she's like pulling up all these blogs about people who have done it, and it's accessible to different physical abilities and all this stuff. And oh my God, I mean, I'm so glad that I did it. And it was hard. And I was just having a conversation with someone about this the other day, where I was like, one step at a time, you know, that was playing in my head over and over. And there was one time, like a few days, where my knees were really in a lot of pain, but I was just like one step at a time. And it's like that some of these simple phrases that you hear that seem like they're like cliches, you know, there's just so much wisdom in it. And so, yeah, it just kind of came about by recommendation of other travelers. And again, something that I would have never just set out with the intention of doing or thinking I could do, but just found myself in a position where I was doing it somehow.
This feels like your trip out there really was your stay in, what's the term I'm looking for? Like a Hazleton type center. And instead of going to a center, you toured Asia. You toured these exotic places where you're far away from Western culture and got connected to the planet again.
Yeah, it's interesting because I definitely didn't realize that at the time when I moved into that retreat center, especially because like I was living in such a safe, protected environment. There was, you know, no temptation. Nobody was drinking around me, any of that. And I didn't think about it like that at the time. At the time, I was thinking, oh my gosh, I'm, you know, starting this whole new path of teaching yoga and leading retreats. But looking back, I was scared, and it was a safe environment for me to be in. And that's why, again, when people are like, oh, that was really brave for you to go out there, I was like, I kind of felt like I was feeling really safe and protected, hidden away in the jungle, until I figured myself out and got to know myself again. And how do I exist in this world without substances when that's all I've known since I was like 13? So it definitely was like that. And I always try to like emphasize to people, because obviously my recommendation for getting sober is not going to be like, oh, just move to Cambodia, go check into a retreat center for a year, or move into an ashram or something. I mean, I think those environments can be so helpful and supportive for learning the tools, but you can take the key principles of what was being created there and apply it to your life. And that was actually what we always told people when they came on retreats as guests, because for a lot of people, it was a huge lifestyle change. Like all of a sudden, you know, they're used to living very differently. And it was like, this is not an opportunity to just, you know, bang out a retreat and get all the stress out that you've accumulated and then go back to your normal routine. It's like, how do you bring some of these key principles, like having a daily practice where you tune into your body and your breath and meditation and all of these things, eating mindfully, connecting with nature. Like, how do you bring that into your life? And I think I learned a lot through direct experience of how powerful some of those practices can be by being in that environment.
It's one thing to do this in Cambodia where you have no other choices. It's another thing to bring it back to the United States where the world's noise comes back to you. It sounds like your mother and you are very close enough where you're vulnerable enough to say a few times, Mom, I have this problem and I need you to help me. When you did this and you flew over to Cambodia, what was Mom's thoughts?
Yeah, well, I have to say it's both of my parents, fortunately, that have been really supportive through this whole process. And it was my dad is super adventurous and we've always we always have had a great time together. And he, from his perspective, like, he'll joke about this now. It was like, I had to come over to make sure she didn't join some cult out there, you know, which of course he knew that I didn't, but he came out to come and like see it and experience it. And yeah, I think for them, it was, I made a point because I knew that was going to be a little bit of like a scary thought, especially, I mean, starting at the point when I said I was going to leave my job. In order to like leave this job, I had this like career that, you know, was on a good track with. I was high functioning, even though like this was all going on, to then quit and go to Southeast Asia. Like that was scary in itself. And so I was really intentional throughout all my travels. I would write these long email logs of like everything I was learning and all the tools I was picking up and about the culture and museums. So I was like making a point to be like, this is beneficial. And so, yeah, when he came out, he was actually really amazed with the center and just the philosophy. The man who runs that center, Joel, is just a brilliant human being, like has just applied this idea of being so present with whatever you're doing to so many different areas of his life that he was like a classically trained musician, spoke 7 languages, was a chef. So he started to like see what was going on there and was just sort of like, this is incredible. And so very accepting of it.
If you're there for a year, how do you come back? I look at if you're going to go for a few months, it's easy to look at that as I'm here temporarily. But when you get to a year, what is it that makes you say, well, I'm not going to stay here permanently. I'm going to go back. What does that look like?
So I didn't go back for about 8 years.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Yeah. So after I finished a full year at that retreat center, which was longer than I anticipated. But I spent a year there and then I ended up going to India. I was going to be in India for 6 months. It ended up being 4 because I got an opportunity to go teach at a resort on an island called Sumba in Indonesia. And so then I started working out there and I was in charge of the wellness program there and teaching yoga classes and, you know, contributing to various parts of like activities and things like that. Very remote island of Indonesia, beautiful beaches and just very incredible culture. And I decided to start facilitating and running my own retreats. So before I had been part of a retreat center where I was teaching yoga, and then I was working as the resident yoga teacher of a resort. And then I wanted to start organizing my own retreats. So the first one that I did was in Nicaragua, and I partnered with a couple of friends that they weren't teaching yoga, but they both had taken kind of big risks to move away from an unfulfilling career to start their own creative businesses. And so we kind of designed this retreat where yoga and creativity collide. And we had yoga and vision boards and just experiencing life in Nicaragua. And then that kind of took on a life of its own where that was incredible and getting to have the creative freedom around that. That just expanded to all over the world, really. I mean, I was kind of alternating between being based somewhere as the resident teacher and then organizing a certain number of retreats every year that I would host myself or in collaboration with other teachers.
When you're doing this, are you ever thinking, I'm going to come north of the Tropic of Cancer, or I may do this for the rest of my life? I might be in these tropical places, most beautiful places on the planet for the rest of my life.
Yeah, I think for me, I really loved being around. I loved being in a space of traveling and meeting people who are traveling. And I still have that kind of this is the interesting thing. It's like the part of me, I think, that was always looking for this like elevated experience has definitely, which maybe was once searching for that in substances, has definitely now fueled me on experiencing new countries and all of that. So I didn't actually see myself. It was people, like friends would always ask me, are you ever going to move back? Or like, are you going to come back to the States? What are you doing? And I couldn't really answer that. I was like, I'm kind of just seeing where life takes me and seeing, kind of being present with this whole thing. But I did move back to the States last year, and it's been amazing to be back. And you just appreciate, like, it was my first winter that I went through for a full winter in a long time. And
what
I could
was
just
that like? That sounds horrible, going through winter again after all that.
It was great. You know what I really appreciated is that I've been in Indonesia for a long time before that, and the weather stays pretty consistent. I mean, you have a wet and a dry season, and the sun sets at almost the same time every day. And so just really feeling into the change of seasons. Like in the winter, I was really like hibernating and being by the fire and reading. And, it felt like that quiet inward time to just relax a little bit. And now it's like the weather is changing again. It's getting warm. The sun is staying out much longer. I'm like tuning back into that cycle that I was always used to living in Chicago. So now I'm like, spring feels like a celebration. I want to get outside. I want to go hiking. And most importantly, being close to my family. I mean, I was always coming back and forth to visit, but just being able to see them every day has been amazing.
What did you do for recovery? I don't know if you went to meetings during that 8-year stretch. What did that look like in terms of the tools or whatever you did to stay sober?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was going to meetings when I was in Chicago, and really yoga was what I could feel was doing the most for me and in terms of keeping me sober. And I love to go to teachers that really bring in the philosophy. And, for people who are newer to yoga or don't go much, I mean, you can go to a class and it can feel like a fitness class. You can go to a class and you could feel like you're in a philosophy talk. And I always loved teachers that would weave wisdom in. So I always benefited a lot from that. But when I started traveling, I didn't really have access to meetings. Now it's amazing, actually. Like I remember the first meeting I found in Southeast Asia was in Bali. And I know that they're all over the world. But what was really cool is Tommy Rosen, who's the founder of Recovery 2.0, started this Recovery 2.0 online conference. And it like brought together all of these incredible speakers. This was before, now this is so common, like especially over the last couple of years, these online conferences. But I thought this was mind-blowing. Like I'm in the jungle of Cambodia is when I first came across it. Mm-hmm. And I'm watching like Gabor Mate and my teacher Nikki and Halakuri, like all of these people that teach like trauma-informed yoga and recovery and all of that. And so that's when I started kind of tapping back into, or in addition to what I was doing with yoga, really like being able to tap into the recovery space. And I remember when I found that conference, I was like, I really miss this. Like, it's been so nice being in this contained yoga space. And I have all these practices that are definitely keeping me sober. But that was like a very powerful reminder of like, you need to be plugged into people who get it. And so, yeah, staying in touch with the online community. And then also I found my teacher, Nikki Myers. I did my first training with her. Shortly after that, I flew back to the States and started studying Y12SR, which is yoga of 12-step recovery. And it was tricky though, because I have to say, I had a lot of shame about being in recovery, even a few years in. I mean, I remember when I was at the retreat center, we would all go around and share our stories. And as teachers, we would introduce ourselves and what led us into this path. And I remember like, I wanted so bad to share this part of myself, but I was still terrified. And so I had a lot of work to do. I look back and I don't know, because it's so interesting to me because I was such a strong advocate for like being vulnerable and accepting parts of yourself. And that really brought a lot to the surface for me. And there was a lot of work around that. And I think I had such high expectations for myself. And especially like after I got sober, it was like, I wanted to be doing everything right as a yoga teacher. And I wanted to like, I was waking up and I was doing my meditation and my practices. And I looked back and the pendulum had just swung, and I was trying so hard to like be good, and I just couldn't own that part of myself yet. And it took some time, but the point that I was able to actually like integrate that all of that was such a sigh of relief. And I think part of it too, part of the reason that I was scared too, is the conversation is different now, in my opinion. People weren't really having open conversations about being sober and being in recovery.
So changed in 10 years. Because our sobriety dates we're pretty close. I got sober in 2014, you in 2013, so we're close. But you're right, the pendulum is totally swung.
Yeah, and I'm so grateful for that too, because I don't think there's anything to fear. Like, I speak so openly. I mean, it's like I speak so openly about all of it now, and it's interesting because I think a past version of myself would be shocked to hear me openly speak about doing cocaine and all of that. But I think it just takes time. And I tell that to people too. Like, it's so important to be able to find your people that you can be open with. I didn't reject this part of myself in the recovery space as I did the first time that I went to treatment. I didn't even share about the extent of my substance use with my group in group therapy. But, I was very open and vulnerable with my recovery community, which I think is really, really important. So I think I always tell people, like, you don't have to be ready to shout it from the rooftops or post it all over social media. But I do find it to be so important to be in those safe spaces, because that was where I was like exercising that muscle of getting comfortable with owning this part of myself. And eventually, clearly now I'm very comfortable with talking about it.
And passionate about it. How do you then reconcile the tradition around anonymity?
So I don't consider myself as somebody who is like, I'm not actively engaged in the AA community right now. And I have full respect for like the program, and I've benefited so much from the 12 steps, but I don't really feel like I have a responsibility to stay anonymous with my own sobriety. And I loved when I was talking to you, how you shared, I thought you framed it so well, where you said like, you can choose to not be anonymous about yourself, but of course, respecting the other people's choice to remain anonymous. I think that's exactly how I've taken it. And so I feel like by me being willing to share about my own story, I can give other people permission to accept this part of themselves. And that was just it. That's why I eventually did start sharing about it, because I felt like people would say to me, like, ask me about, the teaching yoga and the traveling and what led you to do that. And it would not be honest if I just said, oh, I just decided, just thought I'd get up and quit my job. It's like, no, it started with the fact that I had this. Yeah.
It's like the old joke of, how is the show, Mrs. Lincoln, besides that? It's sort of like, that's the whole story. If you're going to tell the story about you going on this trip, you're not telling the story at all if it's not about because I decided to give up substances. Otherwise, the context is not there, and what you learn from it and why you were so open. I am so passionate about being vulnerable and risking somebody taking advantage of my trust than missing that opportunity to engage with trust with somebody else where I wouldn't have. And that's hard. That's hard emotionally to do. But if you're not vulnerable, how are you never going to get to that point? So yeah, I'm very passionate about that whole anonymity thing, that I understand it. And I think there are some things that hold us back where we can hide from the world instead of bringing this beautiful message out that could help that next person. And I look at somebody like you where you're reinforcing my thought that we got sober because we were picked by some spirit of the universe because we needed to help somebody else. It's like, you got a side benefit. You're going to get to be sober. But the price of this is a lifetime of helping other people, and you have unique talents to do so.
Yeah, I think it's exactly that. It's like I think we all have this inclination to want to help someone else. It almost would feel wrong to prioritize my own pride and this fear of being judged when there could be someone else who's like me, who particularly when I think about it, it's like, I didn't have anyone modeling what a lifestyle could look like that I connected with. You know, I didn't see anyone who was my age or like embodying something that I could imagine for myself. So why would I not be that person for someone else? And why would I ever prioritize the people who might judge me? And I mean, I'm sure they're out there, like, you know, but why would I prioritize that person over the person who actually is sharing the same struggle? And that was what led me to ultimately be like, get over yourself. Like, who cares if people judge you?
I love that mindset of get over yourself. And I also look at this of your yoga practice, that to me, this gives you more credibility of look what I've overcome and look what it is in yoga that has brought me to a place where I have this, you know, I have this life better than I could ever imagine. And maybe you don't have a third of the problems that I have. What could yoga bring to you? What could this lifestyle, this spirituality connection bring to you if it did this to me? I just look at that example, just even for normies.
Yeah, I think everyone. And I think, too, I love the women of She Recovers say we're all recovering from something. And I find that to be so important and so true. And it's really all happening on a spectrum. And I see recovery as the greatest gift in a way, because I have gained these tools that I wouldn't necessarily need to have really committed myself to. Things that support me every single day, like yoga and breath work and meditation and engaging with this community that is really there for me in a genuine way. And, you know, I could just go on. And so it's like everybody could benefit from having those tools. And I'm really glad that we're in a conversation now where we do talk about this on more of a spectrum.
Yes.
And that, like, you don't have to necessarily consider yourself an alcoholic, that you could just say, could my life potentially be better if I wasn't consuming substances that are effectively poisoning me, you know?
Tell me about the podcast. What got you into this industry that you got to grind this out every single week? This is my part of it. Like, hey, we do a podcast. Podcasting is hard. Podcasting takes a lot of work. What got you into this? What's your vision for what you're doing with your podcast?
Yeah, well, it's funny because I was thinking back on this when I first actually did start the podcast. I remember when I was traveling, before I even really, it was like when I was first starting to understand about podcasts. And I said to a friend, I was like, I'm meeting all these interesting people. Like, I want to do some sort of interview thing where I have them share their stories. And I didn't end up following through on that. It'd be really interesting to think if I did, what that could have looked like. But it didn't really like pull me I didn't have a concept around it. But when it came to this, I love all things like recovery, and especially this whole holistic approach, and how, you know, the philosophy of yoga marries with the 12 steps and all the different approaches now and pathways. And so I just felt like it was something that I wanted to do, to be able to also, for people who are not at a stage where they're going to get into a meeting, because I actually see that for me, it took major desperation, and then there was major resistance, and then there was so many times that I turned away. So how about all the people who are maybe not going to ever show up in a meeting or are not ready to get there? Can I give them the opportunity to just like listen in to these conversations and just see if they connect with something, and see that maybe someone that they identify with might be able to have something to offer them? So that was kind of the thought process behind it. And it's so funny because I remember when I started off, I was like, all right, I see all these people saying you need like a weekly podcast. I think I can think of like 5 or 6 people. And now all of a sudden it's like the floodgates open. And the more you start like getting into the world of podcasting, I'm just amazed at how many people there are that I want to have conversations with. And yeah, so it's been a very fun thing, but definitely, like you said, a major labor of love.
I look at this with podcasts, as you might say, like, what's the best podcast out there? I'm like, there is no answer to that, because what I love and connects with me may not connect with you, and that's okay. There is this spectrum of what fits you and your personality. And to me, there's not enough recovery podcasts. When I first got sober, there was one that I could find. And now look at this niche here of people who are into 12 steps and recovery and the spirituality around yoga. And there are not one, there's multiple podcasts about that, that you can find something like that that's going to connect you. And if this is your entry point, that's the thing where you can connect with somebody. Well, you must be doing well, because I saw you just interviewed Laura Cathcart Robbins. That's a pretty big get. That's pretty big. She does a pretty big show.
Yeah, she's great. And I have to thank my friend
wonderful.
Carrie May for making that introduction, who I'm actually just so grateful for in so many ways, because she's also started this sober community in Chicago AF. And so I actually first connected to her because I'm like, somebody is starting a sober community in Chicago. You would have changed my life then. And we've just had a fast friendship. We're actually hosting a retreat together in September. And so she introduced me to Laura, which was so nice. And Laura is just an amazing woman, and her book was incredible. And I felt very grateful to be able to interview her on that.
Oh, yeah. I was so happy to see that you did that. I like to root for other people. What do I need to know about you? What are the things you're doing other than the podcast or places we can find you?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I have an online community, the Sun and Moon Community Membership. And so I have a group. We meet once a week on Sunday mornings, and we always start with a meditation and breathing practice, and then go through a theme together and kind of work through that. And then within that membership, people have access to pre-recorded trainings and movement classes, tapping, meditations, breathing practices. And so that is a really great way that I like to actually be able to like engage with people in a more like community-based way. And so there's that. And then I've also just started doing retreats specifically for sobriety. So I've been doing retreats now for about 9 years, but the first one that I ever did was just last month. That was partnering up with Deb Massner from the Alcohol Tipping Point, and we had a group of sober women in Taos, New Mexico, and I've got another one coming up in Colorado in September with Carrie. And that has been like, I feel like it's like all my passions colliding. And so that's something I'm hoping to do a lot more of, is retreats for people who are sober and sober curious.
What's your website? Where are the places that people can find you if they want to reach out?
So it's sunandmoonsoberliving.com. And then on Instagram, I share pretty actively on there. It's at sunandmoon.soberliving.
That's awesome. This is awesome that your passion, well, first of all, something you really, this became your life. And when you were in that marketing company with the beer cart going around, never thinking that your life would turn this way and it would be so much greater. Like that is one hell of a left turn. And just think that your passion could attract somebody else who didn't have this in that you had. So there could be 12 Marys that could be reached because you had to go through this. That, hey, it would be great if you had this. But now that because you didn't, you've created a door open for 12 to 100 other women to come in the same way.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think something that I always just like to encourage people with, it's like, if you have this inner voice that's telling you that there's something else out there for you and that it's worth giving it a try and really getting in touch with that. And that's why I love these practices that really allow you to connect with yourself, because, 10 years down the line, it seems like, whoa, this has been like a radical change from where I started. But it happens, just one day at a time, one breath at a time. I like to think about it and just finding trust in that inner guidance, because I really do believe that, if we allow ourselves to tune into that, then incredible things can happen. And it's possible for absolutely anyone.
I must have had, in the time that we were talking, 20 other questions I could have asked you, but I would have interrupted you and would have took you this way and that. Like I have like millions of other questions to go through because this is so fascinating. I hope you like this and you add Mary to your repertoire, the Sun and Moon Sober Living podcast. And although I'm from a 12-step tradition, I have pride in the fact that I am genuinely curious about how other people get sober. What are those other paths? Because in the end, whatever you're doing that gets you to a place where you no longer need alcohol and you can handle life on life's terms, that's the right path for you. And there are lots of right paths, regardless if mine or yours is different. For somebody else, that's right. And the more people we can get productive and realizing that, no, if you put down the bottle, when you think that life is going to be over for you, it's going to be so much more amazing than you could ever imagine. Like you're holding yourself actually back by doing this. But that's the right thing. Mary, thank you so much for coming on the Sober Friends podcast today.
Thank you for having me. I'm so grateful that we were able to connect, and I love hearing your story too. I can't wait to share it.
Awesome. And we'll talk to everybody next week. Bye, everybody. You made it this far into the podcast. That tells me you're a pretty big fan. If you like what we do and you find value in the podcast, consider a donation at buymeacoffee.com/SoberFriendsPod. Your donation keeps us on the air to help out the new guy and helps us defray some of our costs. If you find value in our podcast, please consider a donation at buymeacoffee.com/SoberFriendsPod.